The city lived its own life, the flow of cars, the lights of advertisements, passers-by rushing about their business. Without stopping for a moment, the evening air was thick, filled with the smells of fried meat from food trucks, coffee from cafes, and autumn dampness. He walked unhurriedly, almost dissolving into the crowd, but not completely. People noticed him. A woman in a business suit passing by lingered her gaze on him for a moment and slightly wrinkled her nose, as if sensing an unpleasant smell. A young guy with headphones glanced at him and quickly looked away. An elderly couple strolling along the sidewalk subtly pressed closer to each other as they passed by. He saw all of this. He was used to looks, but not these. No one shouted at him, pointed fingers, or mocked him, but in those fleeting glances there was something stronger than words: rejection, as if his very presence was out of place on these brightly lit streets. Two guys sitting on the steps of a cafe paused their conversation. As he walked by, one of them smirked slightly and said something to his friend, making him chuckle softly. The store window reflected the lights behind the glass. People flickered, choosing products, placing them in baskets, checking prices. The warm light inside looked almost cozy. He stopped for a second and then opened the door and stepped inside. The store door closed behind him with a soft jingle, leaving the hum of the city behind. Inside, it was warm. The light from the lamps spread across the clean floor, reflecting off the refrigerator windows. At the cashier, the scanner beeped as it rang up items. Somewhere in the far aisle, someone was loudly discussing which sauce to choose for pasta. It seemed like an ordinary evening in an ordinary supermarket. But as soon as he entered, the air subtly changed. The shoppers at the checkout instinctively stepped back a little. A middle-aged woman, selecting vegetables, stopped halfway. Her gaze slid over him and quickly turned away. A young guy in a hoodie typing something into his phone involuntarily took a step aside when Tom walked past. There were no shouts, no sharp words, just these small, almost imperceptible gestures. Tom walked between the aisles, looking at the shelves. He wasn't in a hurry. His movements were measured, but in every gaze that caught him there was tension. Behind the counter, in the bakery section, a girl in a uniform was putting fresh croissants into plastic containers. She slid a glance over him quickly, assessed his appearance, and subtly frowned. Tom stopped by the fruit section, took an apple in his hand, feeling its cool, smooth surface. It was almost perfect, without spots, heavy, ripe. "Excuse me, sir, are you looking for something?" The voice sounded close, calm, steady, but tense. Tom slowly turned his head. In front of him stood the salesperson, a man about 40, in a blue shirt with a name tag. Mike. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't rude either. In his eyes was the same question that had already been in the gestures of others. "What are you doing here?" "I just want to buy something," Tom answered calmly. Mike's gaze slid over his clothes. His eyes narrowed just slightly. "Do you have money?" Tom tilted his head slightly, as if he hadn't heard. "Are you from around here?" Mike asked, changing the question. "Somewhere nearby," Tom replied, turning the apple in his hand. The bakery section fell silent. The girl, who had been arranging the croissants, froze, pretending to focus on her work, but her eyes were directed at the conversation. Two men by the dairy fridge exchanged glances. One even made a sound. "You can look at what you need, but quickly." "Okay," Mike said. His tone remained even, but there was a sense of finality in his voice. "I want you to leave." Tom stared at him for a few seconds, slowly put the apple back. He knew what would happen next. Tom lingered, his gaze on the apple he had just placed back on the shelf. His fingers still felt the cool, smooth surface of the fruit. He could simply turn around and leave. It would be the easiest decision, but not today. "Why?" quickly, he calmly asked, looking up at Mike. The salesperson didn't expect the question. His lips pressed together for a moment, as if he was searching for an answer that would sound justified. It's customary here for customers not to." He paused, as if he caught himself saying the wrong words. "Not to linger," Tom suggested, stepping aside, as if genuinely considering other fruits. Mike sighed heavily. "You see, this is private property, and if we think some people might cause inconvenience to other customers, Tom raised an eyebrow. Have I already caused inconvenience? Mike glanced at the cashier. An elderly woman with a bag in her hand was openly watching their conversation. Somewhere farther in the drinks section, a man in a business suit had taken a can of soda and was pretending to be absorbed in reading the ingredients. We don't want trouble, Mike said quietly. Tom smiled slightly. Trouble starts when you start seeing a problem where there is none. He took another apple, spun it in his hand, and tossed it into the nearby basket. I have money, he said, looking Mike straight in the eyes, and I haven't done anything to get kicked out. Do you really think my presence here is a threat? Mike was taken aback. It seemed like he wanted to say something, but Tom was already moving on to the bakery section. The girl behind the counter froze when he approached. Do you have fresh croissants? He asked. She nodded, glancing nervously at Mike, who was still by the fruit. Yes, just baked. He nodded, took the package, and put it in the basket. Thank you. The girl didn't respond, just nodded. Tom felt the gazes. They were everywhere: distrust, evaluation, premature conclusions. But he wasn't planning on quitting this game. The next stop was the checkout. The woman standing in line ahead of him quickly counted the change, grabbed her bag, and gave him a quick look before leaving. The cashier, the same young girl who had been talking to a colleague a few minutes ago, was now noticeably tense. Is that all? She asked, ringing up the croissants. Yes, and also an apple. Tom nodded. She scanned his items and named the price. Tom pulled banknotes from his pocket and placed them on the counter. When the cashier reached for them, he noticed her fingers twitch just slightly. It lasted only a second, but that was enough. He took the change, grabbed the bag, and slowly turned toward the exit. The bell on the door rang again. The air outside felt lighter. But this was just the first battle. The next stop was the restaurant. The street greeted him with a cold breath of wind that tousled his hair and slipped under the collar of his worn jacket. People hurried past, lost in their thoughts, not giving him a second glance. Longer than a few seconds, but he knew. If he stood in place longer, if he started asking something, the reaction would be completely different. He walked along the sidewalk, calmly chewing on a piece of croissant. The taste was the same as always, soft, slightly sweet, with a thin crust. Food, like many things in this world, had no prejudices. Ahead, the warm lights of the restaurant glistened. Wide windows opened to a view of a cozy interior, soft chairs, wooden tables, dimmed light that gave everything a special, intimate hue. People sat in groups, talking, laughing, gesturing with their hands, savoring their meals. Tom slowed his pace, catching familiar smells of roasted meat, spices, freshly baked bread. His stomach responded with a light squeeze, reminding him that a real dinner was still ahead. He opened the door and stepped inside. The sound of a soft bell sliced through the air, but the conversations didn't quiet down. Only a few visitors glanced his way before returning to their business. But the staff reacted differently. The girl at the bar noticeably tensed when she saw him. The waiter, carrying a tray of drinks, subtly clenched his jaw. Behind the counter stood a man in a spotless white shirt with neatly trimmed dark hair. His eyes immediately narrowed. Tom approached closer. Good evening, he said in a level voice. The administrator slid his gaze over him. Sorry, we have no free tables. Tom slightly raised an eyebrow. Interesting. He slowly turned his head and looked at the empty table by the window, then at another one near the far wall. The administrator seemed to not notice this. Do you have a reservation? He continued in the same even tone. No, but is that a problem? Tonight is a very busy evening. Tom nodded as if pondering. And yet I see a few empty tables. The administrator briefly smiled, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Those are reserved. Tom tilted his head slightly. Reserved for what time? The administrator pressed his lips together. In a few minutes, there will be many guests here. We simply can't allow. What exactly can't you allow? Tom quietly asked. The man before him froze. A short pause hung in the air. Somewhere a few tables away, two young women were talking about a new movie nearby. A man in a suit was browsing something on his phone with his leg crossed. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But here in this microcosm, between two gazes, a quiet battle was raging. The administrator seemed to be weighing his words. "You see," he said after the pause, "we are a certain level establishment. We care about the comfort of our guests." Tom slowly nodded. "And my appearance doesn't suit you." "I didn't say that." "But you thought it." The man didn't reply. "I'll ask again," Tom continued calmly. "Is there a free table for a visitor who just wants to have dinner?" The administrator slid his gaze over his worn jacket, the faded jeans, the small stains on the sleeves. "No," he replied. They stared at each other for a moment. Tom exhaled quietly. "I understand." He stepped back, took one last look at the empty table by the window, then turned and headed for the exit. The bell rang again when he stepped outside. The cold evening wind hit his face. Tom ran a hand through his hair, pushing a strand from his forehead. He wasn't surprised. But the feeling in his chest was heavy. He stood on the sidewalk looking into the distance. Somewhere far away, a car hummed in the windows of neighboring buildings. The light of televisions flickered. Life was bustling. But that wasn't what mattered now. Now he had to decide whether to go further or turn back. Because the real conversation hadn't started yet. Tom stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the cold night air, his fingers involuntarily clenched into a fist, but not out of anger. Out of thought. He had long known that the world operated on unwritten rules, but every time he encountered them, he felt a strange emptiness. The feeling of injustice was familiar, but this time something was different. He looked again through the large window of the restaurant. Inside, people continued their conversations. Laughter dissolved in the warm air. Waiters brought plates of steaming dishes. He wasn't among them, not because of a lack of space, not because of a lack of money, but because of something invisible that influenced the decisions of others. He sighed and walked further down the street. A few minutes later, he entered a small cafe on the corner. There were no crystal chandeliers or leather sofas here, but the smell of fresh coffee and the warmth of the lamps pleasantly enveloped the space. The woman at the counter, about 50 years old, looked at him not with disgust, but rather with slight surprise. "What will you order?" she asked calmly. "A cup of coffee and a sandwich if you have one." She nodded, rang up the check, and went to prepare the order. No questions, no scrutinizing looks. Tom sat down on the wooden chair by the window, and for the first time that day felt truly relaxed. He wasn't trying to prove anything, not arguing, not making a scene. He was just going to a place where he wasn't judged by his clothes or appearance. The woman brought the coffee and sandwich. "You're not a frequent guest here," she remarked, placing the cup in front of him. Tom smiled. "Yes, but I think I'll be coming back more often." She nodded as if understanding something more than he had said out loud. He took a sip of hot coffee. Somewhere there in the large restaurant, the waiters were still bringing orders. People were discussing movies and weekend plans. The administrator had probably already forgotten about him. But Tom would remember this evening. Because it wasn't about loss, but about choice. Tom sat there, the warmth of the coffee spreading through him, grounding him in the moment. Outside, the city buzzed, indifferent to his small but significant choice. He thought about the restaurant, the cold reception, the invisible barrier that had kept him out. It wasn't the first time he had felt this way, excluded, judged based on appearances, circumstances. But this time it felt different. This time he wasn't chasing approval. As he sipped his coffee, he realized that the world outside the cafe had a way of imposing its rules on everyone. But tonight, in this small space, he was free from them. He wasn't a customer trying to fit in. He was just a person, sitting quietly with a simple cup of coffee. His phone buzzed, a message from an old friend. "Still up for the game tomorrow?" Tom smiled to himself, tapping a quick response. "Yeah, I'll be there." He wasn't sure if he was going to the game for the sport or for the company. Maybe it was both. The woman behind the counter glanced at him, her expression softening as she wiped down the counter. Tom returned her gaze, and for the first time that evening, he felt seen. Not for his clothes or his history, but simply as he was, a person who had walked in looking for a moment of peace. He stood up, leaving a tip on the table, and turned toward the door. The bell above it jingled softly as he stepped back onto the sidewalk. The cold night air hit his face again, but it didn't feel the same. There was a strange lightness in his chest, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he had made the right choice. As he walked away, he looked back at the cafe, the warm light spilling out through the windows. It wasn't about the places you went or the people who accepted you. It was about finding the moments that reminded you that you were enough, just as you were. And for the first time in a long while, Tom felt that.